Let's go.
Today is the August installment of Domestic Homicides. Now, this one is not an intimate partner homicide, but it's definitely domestic, and it's of a topic that you might be interested in, as I am: kids who kill their mothers. And of course, there is very little information for today's story because it just was not reported on, but that is not going to stop me from talking about it because I think it's a very important story to tell. I have become a little bit frustrated with this project that I've given myself with these intimate partner homicides. I don't have the ability to sit in a courtroom and take my own notes. And pulling court documents is actually a lot more arduous here in Canada than you would think, considering it's public information. You have to know the case name, you have to know specific dates, and then what documents you want to be pulled. I mean, you could just, I guess, ask for everything, but at $20 per request and then like a dollar per page, and I don't even want to think about what it costs for audio and video, it's not really feasible for me to do. There are no Canadian courtrooms that are video recorded or televised. So if you don't have media credentials, nobody talks to you. So being a podcaster here in Canada and making almost exclusively Canadian content is a lot of work. And I have to rely mostly on accredited media people to like sort of do a lot of the work as far as viewing and pulling court documents, and then I just sort of put it all together in my own words in chronological order. So when a case doesn't get any media coverage at all, it is really difficult. So that's just my rant for the day. And this is the murder of Colleen Maxwell. In August of 2018, 73-year-old Colleen Maxwell, she wasn't in the best of health, but she was quite determined to live independently. So she was living in a cooperative building in Toronto's Regent Park off of Cornwall and River Streets. Regent Park is a neighborhood in Toronto's downtown. It was originally part of town that was called Cabbage Town, like a low income area that was exclusively subsidized housing. It was actually once considered the slums in the early 1900s, but concerns over crime and the substandard standard of living conditions there. After World War II, it was turned into a government-run public housing project in 1947, and continued to house low-income families. And over the years, it became in rather a state of disrepair, and so um, crime continued to abound there. So it has currently been undergoing a 5-stage revitalization project, which was started in 2014. The second stage was completed in 2018, and then the third is supposed to be completed later this year. So Colleen's place wasn't exactly grand, for sure, by any measure. It was a one-bedroom unit, it's very small, and she was struggling with quite a few ailments. She had anxiety, blood pressure, or high blood pressure, and rheumatoid arthritis. So she got around by using a walker. But she did have a personal support worker that would come and help, like bathe her pretty, I think it was daily, and then help her with chores around the house, which meant that she can continue living fairly independently, but with support. Her quick wit and her sense of humor made her a lot of fun to be around. She wasn't one for complaining about her problems. And she also had 2 adult sons. There was Matthew, who was 37. He was not married. And then Kyle, who I believe he was just about to make her a grandmother, or he had just recently made her a grandmother. And then her older son, Matthew, had not married. So Kyle was kind of really only her only link to grandmothering, which usually involves spoiling children rotten and then handing them back over to their parents. So Colleen stayed very socially active. She liked to get out quite a bit. She was very well known with all of her neighbors and other people in the building. She was just a really sweet lady with a lot on her plate and on her mind. And one of the big things that was on her plate and her mind was actually her son, Matthew. Now, Matthew had come into her life, a son that she loved and cherished very much, but he had shown signs of being difficult to manage by the age of 5. And of course, there's nothing in any of the information that I was able to obtain where I can see that this management issue was the result of any mental health struggles, like a chemical imbalance that maybe he had from birth, if he had suffered some sort of trauma and it affected his behavior, or if Colleen just found him to be a bit of a handful because he was active and mischievous. But whatever the issues that Colleen had, she had to make the heartbreaking decision to put him into foster care at the age of 5. So whatever was going on with Matthew, she knew that she didn't have the knowledge, the resources, or the ability to care for him with his specific troubles that he was having. And well, of course, it turns out that sadly, although not too surprisingly, the foster care system didn't really either. So over the next 13 years, he would bounce around between 7 different foster homes over his childhood years. He came out the other end as an adult with PTSD and a raging drug addiction. And he also had like a love-hate relationship with his mother, who he felt had abandoned him. Now, I don't know if this is one of those cases where the child goes into foster care and the mom is able to maintain contact over those years, or if he found her later as an adult. Um, Nowadays, there's like a service like Hull where kids with significant behavioral issues can go, where a parent can visit, and I don't know if they actually maintain custody or guardianship of the child, but at least they have regular contact. But the child lives in like a group home situation where they can be cared for and they can have pretty intensive treatment there. But I'm actually not sure how successful those programs are either. It wouldn't have been available to Colleen back when Matthew was young, so this was kind of her best option at the time. But it was voluntary, so like she didn't lose him by way of neglect or abuse. She did maintain having Kyle in her care, and there's no real report of any evidence other than the drug addiction and this PTSD that Matthew, had had a diagnosis of any mental health issues, which of course he was self-medicating his PTSD by smoking crack, which, just FYI, is not really the best method for medicating anything, just so you know. All I do know is that once he was in adulthood, he took up this crack cocaine habit and had this sense of entitlement to his mother. So he had dropped out of school in the 10th grade and from then on had just kind of been bumming around, couch surfing, and smoking crack. So rather than working on his issues, he would like come and stay at his mom's house in this 1 bedroom apartment, laying on her couch for days on end. And if he wasn't given any money by his mom, he would just basically take it. He would also just take her phone and use it for himself. He made a key to the apartment for himself. It's just selfish stuff, like really regular addiction stuff. Like if you've ever been around someone with addiction issues, it's kind of par for the course. It's the reason why making amends is kind of part of recovery, is because you tend to do crappy things to people when you're in addiction. And this continued on for years. So by 2018, Matthew was 37 years old. Colleen's now in her 70s, and she's getting a little bit fed up. She's got these mobility issues. She's just kind of sick and tired of Matthew and his issues, and she's been putting up with it for out of guilt, for many years, for basically putting him out of the house. So Colleen had told friends that Matthew would get money or would get angry if she didn't give him any money. One time he did break her glasses, and one time her phone. And one of her good friends did witness one time Matthew grabbing her by the neck when she refused to give him some money. But she figured she could handle him. It was just Matthew being Matthew. There was an incident. Now, I'm not sure when exactly, but it was in 2003. I don't have a lot of details because, of course, there's no coverage. But Matthew had been charged and convicted of making threats towards his mother. Matthew would have been 22 at the time, and in early August of 2018, Kyle, her younger son, had noticed some bruises on Colleen's arm, and she had matter of factly told him that it was Matthew that had done it. Friends and Kyle encouraged Colleen to get a restraining order or to like press charges or something, but she just couldn't bring herself to do it. And again, it was likely out of some guilt, or it could have been the idea that confronting Matthew and like pressing charges against him would actually make things worse. Like it would increase his level of anger. And I think that she had a right to believe that that would be the case. The laws have changed that around domestic battery, and that it's no longer up to the victim necessarily to press charges. The police can do it. But in order for that to happen, the police have to be contacted and notified of it. And I think calling the police on a loved one is never an easy decision to make. And I think between a mother and a child, it would be even harder. I mean, imagine calling the police on your own child. I think that there would be shame that you would be seen as a bad mother. I just don't think it's ever an easy choice to make. But things had become pretty intolerable for Colleen, and on August 28th, 2018, she told her friend that she had started to become afraid of Matthew. Like before, it was just him being Matthew, just raging verbally, taking things from her and just laying around on her couch. But something about Matthew and his rages had sort of changed, and she had grown fearful of him to the point that Colleen had actually talked to the superintendent of her building, asking him about ways to maybe report elderly abuse. So the superintendent had given her a number and like a pamphlet of some information on a shelter that she could maybe go to. Like her anxiety was starting to get out of control at this point, and she was starting to think that this might be her sort of her next step that she might have to take. The next afternoon, which was August 29th, it was a Tuesday, around 4 p.m., a call to 911 came in from Matthew. He was upset, said that his mom had these mobility issues with her walker. She had fallen several times during the day and that she had just stopped breathing. But when the paramedics got there, so it was 50 Cornwall Street that they had gotten to, they found an obviously battered Colleen laying in the fifth floor hallway of her apartment. She was naked from the waist up. She had a nightgown that was just kind of strewn over her, covering her breasts. But rather than appearing that she had fallen, like several times, as Matthew had said, she had bruises and swelling to her face and neck, including two large lacerations or cuts on her scalp. Um, her left toe had started to like it started the rigor mortis process, showing that she had died actually a minimum of about an hour or so before he had made the call to 911. Matthew was found cowering in a corner of the hallway when the paramedics had arrived. He was crying and rather profusely sweating, a strong odor of booze wafting from him. He told the police that he had had some beer and smoked some crack recently. He hadn't slept in a few days, but that his mom had fallen and just stopped breathing, and that's what's up with that. Now, the autopsy on Colleen later showed that in addition to the visible bruises on her head, she had internal blunt force traumas to her face, head, neck, within her mouth, on her abdomen, her chest, her arms, and her legs. So rather than bother asking Matthew, like, how many times did you say your mom fell that day? They charged him with second degree murder, which of course he pled down to manslaughter. And then, given that he, in the words of Justice John McMahon, said, put in common language, Mr. Maxwell beat his mother to death. He also added that how many blunt force traumas that she'd had was impossible to count them all up. And because of how sort of up close and personal Colleen's beating had been to not only his own mother, but to a vulnerable and elderly woman, he got 15 years, but would, of course, adding up all the time served, credit for stupid COVID lockdown measures, which the courts were giving credit to all kinds of murderers back then. Yeah, that was 2020. Um, it was conditions that the courts and, of course, defense attorneys thought were like rather harsh. He was only required then to serve 9 years, and he also got credit for showing remorse. Now, just so we are clear here, in order to display that remorse, all he had to do was say that he was sorry. Like, there's no eloquent speech or anything like that about how he's going to fix his life or do better, how he stays up all night thinking about the guilt or whatever, whatever. All he had to say was sorry. So he didn't have to look anyone in the eye when he said it. Just say it. They also consider pleading guilty, even when it's a plea bargain to get out of a harsher sentence. They consider that showing remorse because it saves the family. But really, let's face it, the courts and the lawyers a long-winded and expensive trial. He was not required to, nor did he offer what exactly his mother had refused to him this time, and or what boundary she had tried to enforce this time that led him to beat his elderly and disabled mother to death. He was then ordered to provide a DNA sample, basically to make it easier to find him the next time he murders someone. And he was to undergo drug and alcohol counseling and, of course, a lifetime's weapons ban. And then he was asked if he received his COVID vaccine, and he said no. And so the justice put a note in his file and asked that when he entered the prison system that he get one. And he says, you may not be aware that most people in our ICUs and on ventilators are the unvaccinated. All I can do is give you the opportunity to do the right thing for yourself and the community. I just always find it so funny when somebody who suffers from a substance abuse addiction, which is basically chemicals, that they don't want to get vaccinated because they don't want to put chemicals in their body. It's strange. Anyways, so let's talk a little bit about drugs. So, through my research, which is not exhaustive nor professional, it's more of the online psychological research type paper, most children don't murder their parents. So, that's the good news. However, it does happen to about 300 of us each year in North America, and most of those that are going to do it, they do it in their teen years. And a lot of that is because the child or the teenager at that point has found life at home has become intolerable, which could be due to abuse or neglect. It could be that they just can't play Call of Duty till 3 o'clock in the morning. Like intolerable conditions are different for every person. And being that they are teens, the thought of getting a job or sort of supporting themselves is also intolerable. And they don't really see death as this irreversible thing, which it is. So it's a choice that they make in some very rare cases. Then, of course, there's the severely mentally ill person. We're going to kind of put them in a different category because they aren't legally culpable a lot of times. And in most cases, the mental illness is well documented as a history with the person. The abused child is actually the one that's most likely to kill their parents. They encompass about 90% of patricides, which is good news for those of us that don't abuse and neglect our children. They don't normally have any history of severe mental illnesses, and they're not exactly criminal masterminds. Like they leave a pretty easy trail to find them. In a lot of cases, they actually turn themselves in. So the next most common is the mentally ill, which we will again just kind of skip over. Again, it's very rare. And then we have the antisocial child. Now these are the Chandler Haldersons, the Jennifer Pans, the Cameron Rogers of the world. And basically, they get caught in a lie. They are super, super selfish, very, very narcissistic. And as much as the true crime space is made up of these kinds of cases, they are extraordinarily rare. But here's the thing. So there has long been a correlation between like a scientific correlation between substance abuse and violence. And according to the National Library of Medicine in their study, which was called Drug Use Disorders and Violence Associations with Individual Drug Categories, they found that individuals with diagnosed drug disorder have a 4 to 10-fold higher risk of perpetrating violence compared with the general population. And of all the categories of drug disorders, including cannabis, hallucinogens, stimulants, opiates, and sedatives, they were all associated with elevated violence risks. So all drugs carry a risk of violence, like even the hippie weed stuff. And the prevalence of substance abuse, which is out there over severe mental illnesses like, say, schizoid affective disorders, is way, way higher. So it makes the risk to you and I much higher as to also becoming a victim. And so there is one class of drugs that's been shown to be the most addictive and probably the most prone to make a person violent, and that would be stimulants, which include cocaine, crack cocaine, methamphetamines. And now I want to be clear that when I say methamphetamines, I'm talking about crystal meth, not like Vyvanse or Adderall, which is used or supposed to be used in therapeutic dosage. And then there's bath salts and spice, which is also known as synthetic marijuana. So drugs like cocaine, methamphetamines, amphetamines, they usually cause violence or basically dangerous side effects over long-term binges or heavy and chronic use, whereas bath salts and spice, they can cause problems at any time. So the news has for the last probably 10 years, has been sort of filled with opiates and the dangers of them. And I just want to be clear that opiates are very, very dangerous drugs, but they're mostly dangerous for the person that's taking them and the families that get left behind when they overdose on them and die. So I'm not talking about that necessarily. It is a huge problem. I'm focusing here on violent crime and then drug use. So just so you are aware, back in 2014, there was a new dangerous drug that came into being that is very much associated with aggressive and violent behaviors because it causes something called excited delirium, which leads to these violent outbursts, but it also causes the person to overheat really quickly and very severely. I'm not really sure why. but so severely that their organs break down and that they can die from it. It was originally called alpha PVP. Then it started being called Gravol. It's now known as Flakka. So just so that you're aware that that's out there. Now, meth appears to be based on a study that was done in 2016 to be dosage related when it comes to violence. So not the dose that of the at the time that you take it, but like how long and how often you've taken it. So like if you take it one time over a 2-week period, um, it's not as bad. So um, when they studied like one day out of, say, 15 days in a row, they found that it has an odds ratio of 2.8% of being violent, which is between 1.6% and 4.9 if you apply a confidence interval to it of 95%, which is just fancy pants talk. It's like a mathematical equation that they do to things to make the numbers as accurate as possible. If past 16 days of chronic use, that number goes up to 9.5% and as high as 19.1% when they apply that fancy pants 95% confidence interval thing to it. So if you know someone or love someone who is actively taking methamphetamines, crack, maybe dabbling in bath salts or spice, like you need to get the heck away from them. Like forget the intervention thing, like they are dangerous. And I know that the person that they were before they started using meth or crack was not a dangerous person. They were probably very lovely, but the person that's there now is dangerous. So you can love them from afar. You can mail them recovery pamphlets if you need to, but please don't live with them or share space with them until they are clean. I do not want to write a podcast episode about you. And that was the murder of Colleen Maxwell. Go forth and be safe. I'm going to be back again next week with another episode. Oh, and if you have not already signed up for the exclusive content through the link that's on Apple, it's on the podcast part, wherever it is. Now is the time to do it because last week I released an episode that I am very, very proud of. I put a ton of work into this. It is very disturbing, and if you like disturbing stuff, then the exclusive feed is definitely the place for you. Like, listen, I'm not here to judge you. You don't have to justify to me or anyone. I think that it only comes up on your visa as like red circles. So your secret is safe with me. That words like gruesome and disturbing actually draw you in as opposed to chasing you away. It is completely fine. And as always and forever, thank you so much for listening and for watching.